Stewart Hosie.
Thank you, Sir Roger. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I also thank the honourable gentleman from Hartlepool for introducing this debate and speaking so well on behalf of the petitioners. I intend to start just with reference to Brexit, because I suspect much of the concerns about trade deals which may bring the NHS into play will actually be driven by the loss of trade associated with Brexit. And if we remind ourselves of what the UK government's long-term economic analysis said, all of the versions of Brexit analysed, the white paper, the EEA-type agreement, an average free trade agreement, and no deal, all suggested that trade and GDP would be lower at the end of the forecast period than it otherwise would have been. It went on to say that all of those options, with the exception of EEA, which doesn't apply, the situation would be worse if we had net zero migration from EEA workers. So before I come on to trade specifically, it is worth pointing out that we face another challenge in terms of retention and recruitment of staff if whatever Brexit we end up with actually drives a hideous and illogical end to the free movement of people. It's also, there's a second analysis I want to draw on briefly, which was the one from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. They suggested that, depending on the type of Brexit, we could see a 22 to 30% fall in total trade. The same paper went on to suggest that a free trade agreement with the BRICS countries, all of them, and all of the main English-speaking economies, including the USA, would result in somewhere around a 6% uplift. So I suspect what government thinking will end up being, if Brexit happens, is that in order to make up some of the losses, we're going to have a quick win, a quick gain, probably with the USA, and it's hard to see, for a variety of reasons, why the NHS wouldn't be included in that, and I'll happily give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and would he agree with me that it's very concerning that when the President was here on his trip to state visit to the UK, that it was the #1 priority that he seemed to say, despite our own Prime Minister trying to deny that on the day?
It was concerning that his initial response is, yeah, sure, NHS, everyone's on the table. It was clawed back slightly the next day, but one does wonder whether he understood what he said the first day, or even wondered if he understood what he said the second day. I think the real concern, or the concerns out there among the public, are in fact very real indeed, for the reasons I've said, that in order to make up some trade gains from the losses which almost every single forecast suggests we'll have, it means it's hard to see how the NHS or more broad aspects of health might not be included in some kind of trade deal. I think the starting point for me is that we shouldn't be contemplating the prospect of exposing the NHS through trade deals, not least because the EU has made more trade deals than any other bloc with third countries, which we benefit from, and they've done so while protecting public services, and it makes little or no sense to throw that away. They've protected public services like the NHS in all trade negotiations. They've shown to be principled in that approach. Now, not only will we potentially lose access to those markets, but we don't have the means to replicate the agreements which we already benefit from. Now, the honourable gentleman mentioned the Swiss deal earlier, but of course the Swiss deal wasn't rolled over in its entirety. Indeed, a number of the reports which came out at the time said the deal risks new limits on the export of agricultural products, a possible ban on organic products, and that Switzerland may no longer recognise UK businesses as, quotes, authorised economic operators eligible for lighter controls at the Swiss border. But at the same time, a second trade deal or rollover deal was announced, which was the Norwegian one. But of course the Norwegian one, while it did include zero duty for industrial goods, didn't include services. And the agreement, described in the Norwegian press as a crisis agreement, didn't cover technical regulations and rules for trade in food, animals or plants. Now, I only mention those two because what they actually do is highlight the weakness of the UK in this Brexit process if we are not able to roll over in full with very friendly countries with whom we have very long trading relationships. Then how on earth are the public expected to believe we'll be able to cut a deal with the USA to make up some of the losses from Brexit without having to sacrifice and potentially sacrifice the NHS? I'll just let the Honourable Lady intervene one moment. And it goes back to one of the things which was said to me time after time after time on my last visit to the United States. And that was fundamentally this, that the UK will be required to put everything on the table and the US will be required to put nothing on the table. And I'll give way.
The member's being very generous in giving way. Would he agree with me that one of the services implications is the research and innovation sector? And is he as concerned as I am at the prospect that a lot of our universities and the collaborations which are done, which in effect are services, will be at risk and will take an awful long time and an awful lot of effort to replicate in a US trade deal?
I am concerned about that. I'm concerned that even now, we're seeing relationships and partnerships, academic work being restricted or doubt being cast upon its continuation for those very reasons. And when that comes to the area of health improvement, then it would be tragic if the work was not done or the work was lost from some of the excellent universities who currently do and undertake those studies. But the weaknesses I speak about are where many of the concerns around the NHS lie, particularly in relation to a US-UK deal, and which drives the impression, rightly or wrongly, that the UK will be involved in some kind of ISDS, investor-state dispute resolution mechanism, which could see governments or other public bodies sued for simply protecting our health service. So I want very briefly, and I'll end with this, to give 3 examples to demonstrate why I think there are real concerns and where I know the public are extremely anxious. The first example is one between 1995 and 1997. The Canadian government banned the export of PCB waste, in order to comply with obligations under the Basel Convention, to which the US was not a party. The waste treatment company SD Myers then sued the Canadian government for £20 million in net damages. That was under Chapter 11 of the NAFTA agreement, an ISDS-type arbitration scheme. That claim was upheld by NAFTA, even though Canada had taken action to remain in compliance with an international treaty. The second case, in 1997, the Canadian Parliament again banned the import and transport of the petrol additive MMP over concerns that it posed a significant public health risk. Ethyl Corporation, the additives manufacturer, sued the Canadian government, again under NAFTA Chapter 11, for $251 million to cover losses resulting from what they called the expropriation of its plant and its good reputation. That was also upheld by the Canadian Dispute Settlement Panel, and the Canadian government repealed the ban and paid the corporation $15 million in damages, or in compensation. Cases that involved toxic PCB waste and a petrol additive, which was deemed to have a public health impact, were overturned. Now, I think it's quite wrong for any corporation to be able to sue governments simply for taking steps to protect the well-being of its citizens. And I use these 2 examples on purpose, because they may not have a direct clinical NHS procurement characteristic, but no one can be in any doubt they were public health measures which were overturned as a result of a trade deal which allowed private investors to do certain things. The second, or the final example I wish to use is a lot more local. Some time ago in Scotland we had an increasing prevalence of hospital-acquired infection. One of the actions which the Scottish Government took was to remove private cleaners and return cleaning to NHS staff. Lo and behold, the incidence of hospital-acquired infection reduced dramatically. It does not take an enormous leap of the imagination for a non-core work like cleaning to be able to be put out for competition. And had that been an international company utilising an ISDS-type arbitration scheme, one can easily see how they may have sued the Scottish Government in order to win back or get back that work and continue to make profit, irrespective of the health consequences. Now, I've heard what the petitioners have said. I also welcome, so far, the commitments made that the NHS will not be included in any future trade deal. But I think it would be foolish not to recognise the concerns the public have, not to recognise how fraying around the edges with what appears to be non-core, non-clinical work can still lead to the kind of problems which are the concerns of the petitioners. So I will await with interest to hear what the Minister says, and I would simply like to end by congratulating those who signed the petition and brought this important matter before us today.